Evening. I am Gretchen Crosby Sims, the Executive Director here at the Institute of Politics. We are pleased today to welcome Ms. Natalie Duresco to campus this evening for a timely conversation on Puerto Rico's financial future. This event kicks off our spring quarter of programming and will be the first of many events that we're having lined up for April and May. Next week, we will welcome from the UK, Labour MP Ed Miliband on Tuesday, former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Zalmay Khalilzad, on Wednesday, and former White House Senior Advisor Valerie Jarrett on Thursday. That's just 1 week. We've got 8 more planned. Also, our spring quarter cohort of Pritzker Fellows arrived on campus last week, so if there are any students who are interested in attending seminars or scheduling office hours with them, please check out our website at politics.uchicago.edu. Please come early. Please come often to those seminars. A few notes for this evening's program. We will open up the floor to take questions from the audience. Please line up behind the microphone in the center aisle. As usual, we give priority for the first 3 questions to be asked by students, and we remind that questions end with a question mark. Please make sure that your phones are on silent. Restrooms are on the first floor. And here, to formally introduce our speaker, is Nancy Tan. Nancy is a student at the Harris School of Public Policy from Tennessee, and she's in her first year of pursuing a master's of public policy. Please join me in welcoming Nancy to the podium.
I'm here, hello everyone. I'm here to introduce both Ms. Natalie Duresco as well as our moderator, Mike Belsky, today. First, to Natalie, Ms. Duresco, I'd like to say welcome home.
Thank you.
She was born not too far away here in Illinois, Elmhurst, which is about 45 minutes away from here, to Ukrainian immigrants, and earned her bachelor's degree in accounting down the road at DePaul. She also earned her master's degree in public policy from Harvard University Kennedy School and has a distinguished international career in public service and the private industry. She began her career serving in the U.S. State Department and eventually became the first chief of the economic section of the U.S. Embassy in Ukraine, as well as a governor of the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development. In the private sector, she acted as the president and CEO of the Western NIS Enterprise Fund, which dispersed U.S. aid funds to businesses in the Ukraine and Moldova. Ms. Duresco then co-founded and worked as CEO of Horizon Capital, a fund manager with over $600 million under management. 9 months after the 2014 Ukrainian Revolution, she became Minister of Finance of Ukraine. She served as one of the most critical times in Ukraine's history, when the country was affected by a deep recession, foreign occupation, and war on part of its territory. During her tenure, she led the successful negotiation and implementation of the largest IMF program in the institution's history, as well as a complex sovereign guaranteed debt restructuring. And given all of this incredible experience, she is uniquely qualified for her most recent role, one that was appointed in March of last year as the Executive Director of the Financial Oversight and Management Board for Puerto Rico. Today, we look forward to hearing her take on the island's financial crisis. Mike Belsky is leading our discussion today. He is a professor here at the Harris School, and he also has a career that spans both the public and private sector. Professor Belsky has over 30 years experience in the municipal bond industry and has spent most of his career as Group Managing Director of the Public Finance Group at Fitch Ratings. In addition, he served 2 terms as a member of the City Council in Highland Park, as well as 2 terms as their mayor. In his current role, he acts as the Executive Director for the Center of Municipal Finance at Harris, and we look forward to hearing your discussion today. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Great. So we're honored to have you here.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here.
Looking forward to a good conversation. I just want to start and set the stage a little bit. Apologize, I'm a little hoarse, but from teaching for 3 hours. But I'll try to project as well as I can. Puerto Rico is a place right now that's going through a humanitarian crisis because of Hurricane Maria and Hurricane Irma. But before that, it had been going through an economic crisis and therefore a fiscal crisis. 45% of the people in Puerto Rico live at the poverty rate. There's a 12% unemployment rate. The debt to GDP is 70%. The average for U.S. states is 17%. 2/3 of their budget goes to pay debt service. The average in the United States is 5%. So I wanted to just give you some of the outline of what Puerto Rico is facing, and we'll talk about it more. And then a little bit about what we're going to get into with PROMESA, because PROMESA is very unique, and this is a unique opportunity to look at public policy in action. So in the United States, we have a bankruptcy code, you know, Chapter 11 for corporations. Well, Chapter 9 is what municipalities can use. And we know Detroit, for example, went into Chapter 9, and that was $18 billion in debt. And so just by scale, we're looking at 70 million plus, or 70 billion plus in Puerto Rico. States can't declare bankruptcy. They're co-sovereigns with the United States. In the bankruptcy code, territories were excluded. So what bankruptcy does allow for municipalities is for them to take a pause when they become fiscally unable to meet their obligations, things such as debt and pensions, and then to reorganize their debt and their pensions so that they can get on a path to sustainability. One of the things that's very important in Chapter 9 is that the government continues to operate as it's organized. Creditors can't force the government to sell off assets because they have to continue to provide services. Governments can't dictate how revenues and expenditures are made. And so the whole idea is to get the government back into a sustainable place where it can meet its obligations and continue to provide services to people. The other thing that goes on in the United States is we have these fiscal emergency or oversight boards that are put into place preceding bankruptcy so that before you default on your obligations, someone comes in and works with the government. Sometimes they usurp the powers of a city council and for a temporary period reorganize things so that the government can then get back on its feet. PROMESA is a combination of some of the best things that have been done in the United States. So with that, I'd like you to talk a little bit about what the PROMESA law is and how it is different and the same as Chapter 9.
So thank you for that. You are absolutely right that this is the most critical time probably in Puerto Rico's history. The combination of a financial, fiscal, debt, and out-migration even before the hurricane, coupled with what the hurricane has done to the island, the destruction, the devastation, the human cost, has made this unique moment in history for Puerto Rico, a very, very sad moment, but an opportunity. And PROMESA, I think, is to a large extent the tool to make this opportunity come out for the benefit of all Puerto Ricans. And what I mean by that is, if you think of where Puerto Rico would be today without PROMESA, without that law having been adopted in June of 2016, there wouldn't be a stay on the debt. The island would not only be in default, but you would have creditors literally having been grabbing for various revenue streams, for various assets before the hurricane, let alone after the hurricane. The situation would be one of complete disruption and uncertainty, one that wouldn't allow anyone to have confidence that the public education system or the public health system would be able to continue functioning post a hurricane of this sort. PROMESA allowed that stay such that, as you said, you have a period of time within which to try and get your finances together. And that is one of the goals of the board. The board was established by Congress. There are 7 members of the board. The 7 members of the board were nominated by the two parts, the Republicans and Democrats in the Congress, as well as one nominated by the president at the time, President Obama. The board is made up of volunteers. No one gets paid. They are an extraordinarily dedicated group of individuals who bring together a wide variety of skill sets. We have a woman who served as budget director in California under 2 different governors in incredibly difficult times, doing a major fiscal restructuring in California. We have a retired bankruptcy judge that has had experience in some of the largest corporate bankruptcies in the United States. We have a gentleman who is an expert in pension policy, in labor policy, all kinds of things that are very important right now for Puerto Rico. And this group of individuals, volunteers, serve a 3-year term and then will be replaced in the same or similar process. They then hired a staff, of which I'm the executive director, and my colleague, my chief of staff, May Vizcarronde, is also with me today from San Juan. And what our goals are, according to the law, we don't make it up, it's not my imagination, are to balance the budget 4 years in a row, to seek balance 4 years in a row, to restructure the debt, and finally, to return access to the island to the credit markets. And I guess when you put those 3 together, that's a very big group of tasks. Because simply balancing the budget, or simply balancing the budget and restructuring the debt, won't bring back growth to Puerto Rico. It's not enough. It's not enough to change the general economic decline that was occurring before the hurricane. So to get back to access to credit markets, the 3rd part of the goal, you have to actually structurally change this economy so that it grows again. And so that's the work that PROMESA allows. There are very clear tools in the law that were given to us. And the law gave us the ability to use something similar to the Chapter 9 process. It's called Title III in the law. But it allows us to go to the court with a plan of adjustment, as Detroit did, and say, here is how we plan to deal with all of these creditors. Here's how we plan to repay them. This is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to be able to afford what we can afford to repay. And a court will either confirm that plan of adjustment and ensure that it's executed or not.
So before we talk about some of the specific reforms that, in addition to the powers that you have with respect to the requiring balanced budgets, but some of the specific reforms to governance, I wanted to talk a little bit about, how, notwithstanding the hurricane, how did we get here? And maybe you could talk a little bit about, I know there was a change in federal law in 1996 with respect to profits that were received by multinationals that were in Puerto Rico, and what did that change do to the economy?
To a large extent, it's hard to actually grasp the political status of Puerto Rico and how difficult that political status makes the economic opportunities in Puerto Rico. Specifically, Puerto Rico is a territory and not a state. And so for US tax law, it is treated as if it's outside the United States. For customs laws, it's treated as if it's inside the United States. That's a unique combination, which previously in history was used to provide benefits, especially benefits for multinational corporations, US companies to invest, create jobs, and help the economy in Puerto Rico. The types of tax benefits that existed encouraged investment in that way on the territory of Puerto Rico. That was eliminated to a large extent, that last 936, that last large tax preference. Whatever was left in tax preferences under the recent federal tax reform has now disappeared as well. So now Puerto Rico, for tax purposes, is the equivalent of any other foreign country. So if I'm a pharma manufacturer, and pharma is one of those segments that was massively taking advantage of these various tax preferences that existed, there are dozens of medications that many of you take that are manufactured in Puerto Rico and Puerto Rico alone. The pharmaceutical and biopharma companies also, though, invest in Ireland and Singapore. And so this competitive strength that was just eliminated entirely between 2000, did you say 16, I think?
Yeah, it was
936.
96 and 2006.
96, yeah.
Yeah.
And then, and now recently has changed the whole competitive environment for those companies. So federal tax preferences are a part of it, but think of the customs part of it. For a long time, it was a huge benefit to do business in Puerto Rico and be part of the customs union of the United States. And then NAFTA came along. Now, I'm not anti-NAFTA, but what NAFTA did was extend that customs union to many other countries and many other areas, in particular Mexico and other areas that have a much lower cost of labor. Puerto Rico benefits from federal tax law on labor and minimum wage. So when you look at the competitive nature of Puerto Rico, we no longer have the plus, or let's say the competitive advantage of being in the customs union with the US, or we have it, but it's not any different than that of Mexico or Costa Rica or other countries in NAFTA. We've lost the tax preferences, and all of a sudden Puerto Rico, in the moment of the hurricane, in essence, is now looking to say, how do we attract investment? How do we build this economy in a way, structurally, so that we're competitive with Ireland and Singapore for pharma, with the Dominican Republic for tourism, with the United States and Silicon Valley for the IT world. I'm old, so I still call it IT. I'm sorry. I know there's another word for it in the modern world, human capital. Yeah. And so all the other issues of the competitive nature of the economy become so much more important. So it didn't matter as much before, when you had tax preferences, what the cost of electricity was per kilowatt hour. Now the cost per hour of electricity becomes extremely important because you don't have the protection or the savings from tax preferences. So when you think about how Puerto Rico got here, a big part of it is that. I can't say that that's everything, and that would be unfair to say that it's everything. It's also fiscal mismanagement. And fiscal mismanagement is not unique to Puerto Rico. We're in Illinois. I mean, I read the papers. I used to live here. But states like Connecticut, Kentucky, I mean, states all over are having these challenges. The bond markets have been a blessing to many, but they've also enabled a lot of loose spending. And when you can raise capital in the markets, and because of Puerto Rico's status in a triple tax-exempt fashion, right, there's a large market for triple tax-exempt bonds. And you can finance deficits, you can finance overspending, and you really don't have to worry about it. It catches up with you in the long run, and that's what's happened. It's caught up. Yeah. So it's the fiscal policies, but it's also the looseness and the availability of capital, partly because of that unique status that comes all mixed in together. There's one other element I have to raise, which is a demographic challenge. And the demographic challenge did not start after the hurricane. Excuse me. There has been a population out-migration from Puerto Rico for at least a decade. It's unfortunately accelerated post-hurricane, but this problem is not new to Puerto Rico. And that is a component of all of these issues put together. Yeah. When the economy started to decline a decade ago, people sought to seek better opportunity for their families. If public services were not being properly financed because money was getting tight in the budget and public schools and public health care was not of the quality that a family wanted for their children, they sought, and it was easy because they're US citizens. They don't need a passport, they don't need a visa, they're US citizens. They need a JetBlue ticket to Orlando. And it's natural to seek the best place to live. You have that in West Virginia. Right. So it's not, again, unique to Puerto Rico. But this combination then erodes your tax base. Yeah.
So I mean, I think you characterized it well in that I don't disagree with you about 936, but I think it was pretty devastating. They lost 20% of their jobs, so you lose taxpayers. The people that leave, as you said, can freely leave because they're citizens of the U.S. And then all of a sudden you have an increase in social service expenditures for those that remain with less revenues. So you borrow. So I wanted to ask you about the borrowing, is that in most states, there are balanced budget amendments or constitutional requirements for balanced budgets. And I believe there's one for Puerto Rico, but the difference is that you can actually borrow to meet that budget, or that's what they've been doing for many years, is borrowing money through debt to pay for operations. And that's part of the spiral.
That definitely is part of the spiral. I think there are also accountants to someone who served on the Government Accounting Standards Board. There are rules in budgeting that, hardline budgets that don't allow you to use multi-year appropriations, that those didn't exist in Puerto Rico before this year. There is not the use of a single accounting system. The level of transparency of the past, I'm not speaking to the current government, this was inherited, of the past, is extraordinarily difficult to understand. There are 6 major accounting systems. They don't speak to each other. A lot of work on payroll, for example, is still being done manually inputted. They don't use accrual accounting, so they're not necessarily clear about what their liabilities are going into any particular fiscal year. And then finally, for some odd reason, and I'm not, the Oversight Board is not law enforcement, they haven't completed a financial audit since fiscal year 2014. And so that just piles it on.
So PROMESA is authorized to focus on fiscal matters, and some of that is governance structural reform. But before I get to that, I just want to, on some of the causes, in addition to 936, is that we were talking about this earlier, is Puerto Rico, I think 40% of their population is on Medicaid. And the reimbursement scheme from the federal government to a territory versus a state results in some very negative financial consequences.
It is. It's a major cost that Puerto Rico shoulders on the budget of the territory that states do not have to shoulder because of the federal component. There's something called an FMAP, which is basically a percentage, and that percentage is based on poverty levels and population and other components. A state like Mississippi, which would be the poorest state in the mainland, would get 88% of its it would get some 65% of its costs covered. If you would use the same type of formula for Puerto Rico, 88% of the costs would be covered. And instead, we get a block grant, in essence. We get a fixed sum that has nothing to do with that. And instead of what would be about $2 billion a year, we get about $400 million a year. Yeah. Now, there have been exceptions made, and so that's not the case. Today or last year, there was an exception made to bump up those numbers during the Affordable Care Act and recently post-hurricane. So Congress has been very generous just now to provide 2 years of full Medicaid. But it is a cost that over decades has really grown and is being shouldered by the Commonwealth, unlike a state.
Right. I think I had some data here. It was $373 million to Puerto Rico before these special exceptions, and $3.6 billion to Mississippi. So, so there's a lot of things that were stacked against
absolutely
the territory. So talking about some of the structural reforms, in addition to requiring the balanced budget and a fiscal plan, multi-year fiscal plan, and maybe some sort of debt adjustment, there are other things that PROMESA can do. And just a couple data points. So tax efficiency, 44% of the sales tax is not collected there. They have an 11% sales tax. Some of that actually goes to backing a type of bond there called COFINA. And then for PREPA, the Public Power Authority, the same thing. There's a lot of loss of just not collecting or not getting paid what's due. And so looking at those sort of problems there, what are some of the structural reforms that you're going to require of the government?
So the tool that was given to us in PROMESA is a fiscal plan. It's basically a business plan for the Commonwealth or for any of the entities that we cover, like PREPA, which is the electricity company, the public utility. But let's just take the Commonwealth fiscal plan, and we have 2 sets of things that we try to do to achieve balance. One are fiscal measures. We try to increase revenues. That's not always by increasing taxes. A large part of it is increasing compliance, tax efficiency, as you described. Part of it is right rating. So you have certain fees, or you have licenses or permits where the price of them hasn't gone up in 50 or 60 years. So you right rate, you bring them back up to the current day, things like that. There may be tax policy changes as well in terms of trying to collect, for example, in areas where there's a large informal economy, which is typically self-employed individuals, trying to develop something like an AMT, an alternative minimum tax for the self-employed, so that you can simplify the tax, simplify the administration, but get more people, broaden the base that you're collecting from. So that would be on the revenue side, the fiscal measure. On the expenditure side, it would be reforms of healthcare, which is the single largest growing cost in the budget, and then right-sizing the government. Frankly speaking, and this is a big debate, but it's hard to understand how, if you can't afford the government, and you have a government that was built for a population of over 4 million people, 4.5 million people. Today, the population is closer to 3.8. We're not essentially sure since the hurricane, but it's in that range. Should you have 168 government agencies and entities? And so, and are you providing the best services? Forget even the fiscal side of it. For the money that you're putting into it, are you getting the best services for the people of Puerto Rico for the money? Or could you use technology and innovation to better deliver driver's licenses and to better deliver the services that are needed by the people? So right-sizing and using both personnel and non-personnel, better procurement processes, more transparency to reduce the size of the cost of government is another fiscal measure. On the structural side, it's more about how do you change the environment as a whole? How do you change the competitiveness of this market? The number one is changing the cost of electricity, bringing the cost of electricity down so that we're more competitive for manufacturing, for example, with the mainland. And that is a very, very important part of everything in Puerto Rico, and we found that out the hard way by not having electricity for 3, 6, and some people still today don't have electricity in their homes. It's life. Electricity is life, especially in the heat of Puerto Rico. You know, if you're diabetic, you need to keep your insulin cold. If you're on dialysis, you need electricity. It's life, and it's life and death. It's the same, though, for manufacturers. Biopharma needs a consistent temperature for manufacturing. Even if they have a generator, the on and the off, the on and the off, the unreliability of the electricity is not economically a plus. So electricity, reliable and low cost, is the number one goal in terms of structural reforms.
So let me ask you a question about that. So PREPA, the Public Power Agency, I think was nationalized during the New Deal, and it's been a monopoly. Apparently, from Maria, it's not been well maintained, and it's a monopoly. So the question is, and I know there's been discussion about privatization. I think even the governor approved privatization. Can you tell us what's happening in that front?
Sure. That is, in our belief, like the single most important way to change the cost of electricity is we welcome and we applaud and we support the governor's decision and his announcement that he will privatize the generation assets with a goal towards bringing in more alternative energy, which is much more low cost and cleaner than the current generation. The current generation is very expensive, and it's a form of oil, diesel fuel oil, that's very, very dirty on top of being very expensive. So privatizing the generation while bringing in a private manager for a long-term concession of the transmission and distribution system. So the transmission and distribution, kind of the network through which electricity flows to your home, would remain publicly owned, like in LIPA in New York, for example, but it would be managed by the private sector. And the combination of the two, we should be able to bring down the cost of generation dramatically, but also bring down the cost of operations and maintenance with good management. That's the idea behind it, moving from something today in the 28 cents per kilowatt hour right now, maybe even higher sometimes, to a target rate of less than 20 cents per kilowatt hour. Now, I think in Illinois,
Puerto Rico debts is interest. Puerto Rico debts come from payday loans like predatory lending with interest rates of over 800%. Not only this debt is illegally accrued, it's also illegitimate. Natalie Jaresco has a salary of $625,000. The median Puerto Rican earns $19,000. How do you pretend to know what's best for the future of
Excuse me,
people?
this is not a moment for this.
How many people voted?
There is going to be time for questions and answers and comments.
How inspiring are people and setting off our island help our future? How do you pretend to solve the economic crisis with your salaries? how are one of the investment vulture that benefited from the blowing off of Puerto Rico's debt in the first place, and now your mandate is to assure that everyday Puerto Rican pays your accrued interest in these predatory loans. By law, the control board you direct can accept bribes from individual donors.
There is a time for respectful questions and comments.
The privatization of all public utilities, including education, water, and even our roads. Most recently, they have caused the closing of several public universities. In the next few weeks or months, they're going to close about 320 schools. They already closed 200.
There is a time for these questions and comments, and it comes at the end of the
All
program.
argue Puerto Rico's salvation lies in private hands.
I'm asking you to stop.
Has taught us that the supposed solution to our
It's time to
economic
leave.
goals is never sustainable. Okay?
Lucha sí.
Entrega no.
Lucha sí.
Entrega no.
Lucha sí.
Entrega no.
Esa deuda criminal no la vamos a pagar. Esa deuda criminal no la vamos a pagar. Esa deuda criminal no la vamos a pagar. ¡Pa'l carajo la Junta! No te van a tener plataforma ni aquí, ni en Puerto Rico, ni en ningún lugar. Puerto Rico le pertenece a los puertorriqueños. Y nadie nos va a decir cuál debe ser nuestro futuro, excepto nosotros mismos. El pueblo trabajador es el que debe decidir
This
su
is your
futuro.
last warning. It's time to leave.
This debt is illegal. It was accrued illegally. Half of it is interest. And this is just neoliberal policies that are going to put our people in debt. This is, as Jaresco said, life or death. And neoliberal policies are just going to put us in a bad place. We're already in a bad place, you know that, okay?
How does somebody that earns $625,000 a year relate to an average person that earns $19,000?
Okay, this is the time for comments is
How is
over.
it possible
Time to leave.
improve the livelihood of the people if you don't even know what it's like to live with $19,000? To have to pay for milk at $6
Okay,
a
it's over.
gallon.
Esa deuda es ilegal y no la vamos a pagar.
This debt is illegal. It's illegitimate, and we will not pay it. There will be no platform for the control board.
This is not your platform, not now. It's time
And
to leave.
every platform is ours because this is democracy and this is our freedom of speech in whatever place we are. Because we're not just going to protest whatever you cannot hear us, okay?
The university.
Capitalism and neoliberal policies doesn't give people right to let people
Man, this isn't capitalism.
I know what
this is
academic is,
It's a
sir.
talk. It's a talk. You guys
This
can
debt
talk later.
is illegal. This debt is illegal, and we're not gonna pay it. And we have a right to speak out for our people.
Yo, to interrupt like this,
You know what?
undermines
I'm with
everything
you.
you're
But
saying.
you're doing it in the wrong
We
form.
have
I
heard
will do
you.
whatever form is necessary.
Protesters, we've heard you. You've made your point.
It's fair. What is not fair is that people is earning a lot of money, and my people in Puerto Rico is dying. Healthcare in Puerto Rico.
Everything you've said is undermined.
Neoliberal
We will
policies.
pause this event. We will pause this event until we can have a respectful exchange of ideas between the moderator and our invited speaker. There are other opportunities for you to have your voice and your freedom of expression, but this is not it right now. I ask you to sit down or
It is right
leave.
now. It is right now because you're all here hearing what we need to say.
This is a vitally important issue that we're trying to have
That's the
an
reason we are
enlightened
here.
conversation on.
Exactly.
There are
That's the
many
reason we are
perspectives.
here.
Ms. Jaresco's is a vitally important one,
Yes.
and we invite you to later ask respectful questions or organize your own event.
Esa deuda es ilegal y no la van a pagar nadie. La van a pagar la Junta que se va para el carajo.
Puta madre.
Sorry for the disruption. Okay, are we ready to resume? Any other comments that we need to deal with?
Let me try and respond to some of it for you. The imposition of an oversight board or a fiscal board or control board in Washington, D.C. is not the most democratic institution known to the United States of America. You can't deny that fact. And I couldn't deny that I was not elected. It's true. The board members were not elected. That's true. But the elected officials of the U.S. Congress, which had authority over the territories, including Puerto Rico, adopted a law called PROMESA. And the reason was, if PROMESA had not been put in place, you could not count on your retirement, your pension. Let me just take you through the pension hole in Puerto Rico. It's not unique to Puerto Rico. Again, Illinois is having some troubles with this, but Puerto Rico is uniquely underfunded. The employment retirement system, the ERS, which is the bulk of the civil servants, is less than 1% funded actuarially. It could not make retirement payments in 2 years' time. Retirement costs about $2.5 billion per year. And if PROMESA had not come in, put a stay, and had we not moved to a pay-go system, pay as you go, the general fund, the Commonwealth is now paying retirees their pensions. They're paying them today. I'm not saying they're the highest, I'm not saying they're the best. I didn't establish the pension levels. But what I am saying is that today they're receiving their pensions. And that is a blessing for many, many people. Now, there are still bondholders of that same ERS that are getting nothing right now, that believe they have a legal obligation, a contract. Contract law in the United States is the basis for our economy. And they have a right also to figure out how they may get something. Now, the goal of the Oversight Board is not to repay the creditors regardless of what it means for Puerto Rico. That would be ridiculous. The goal of the Oversight Board is to find that balance and to repay what is affordable for Puerto Rico. And so I have respect for the protesters. I understand how painful this is for them. But the sooner the Oversight Board can complete those 3 tasks, 4 years of fiscal balance, restructure the debt, put it down, and regain access to markets, the sooner the Oversight Board is gone. And the democratically elected leadership, legislature and governor and mayors can continue without any so-called interference of the Oversight Board. And so I think if left just on its own, a decision was made in the U.S. Congress that it would not have gotten better. It would have gotten worse. And the numbers kind of prove that.
You're spending a lot of money on lawsuits.
We have at least 55 lawsuits that have been lodged against the government, the board, individual creditors, different groups, a wide variety. Remember also that there are a large group of bondholders. We talk about bondholders and someone used the name vulture. There are certainly hedge funds involved, but a large amount of the bonds were purchased by on-island investors. They were purchased by retirees. This was their version of supporting Puerto Rico, patriotism, while also supporting their retirement. And how this debt restructuring occurs in the end will also affect what's called the bonistas, which is a large group, tens of thousands of on-island holders.
I think there's, of the 70 billion, about 30 billion are owned local.
It's hard to say because so much has been traded in the last year, but that certainly was accurate at some point.
Right, and I think, I also think that, most of them are owned by mutual funds. So this notion that hedge funds own all of this, is they're a minority holder of Puerto Rico's debt. So just, I have to talk a little bit about the politics, not to belabor it. So it is a very difficult situation in that you have a country that has a constitution, not a country, a territory. They have their own constitution. They have an elected legislature. They have a governor. And in order to restore fiscal integrity, there are certain things PROMESA is empowered to do. So for example, if the legislature passes a law that's going to have fiscal ramifications, that's going to cost too much and interfere with the ability to have a balanced budget, you have the ability to reject that law. If they want to go out and issue debt on their own, well, I'm not certain of that, so I wanted you to elaborate on it. And And they can't go out and issue debt on their own, particularly while they're in bankruptcy. But and that puts you in a difficult spot because the governor is playing this as you're trying to usurp his ability to operate his government independently. And so how do you deal with that?
Well, it's a balance, and we have absolute respect for the democratically elected leadership of Puerto Rico, governor, again, legislature, mayors, and no one is trying to usurp their authority. We have to implement the federal law that, as I said, the Congress has adopted, and the sooner we get through this, the better for everyone. I think that our goal has been to cooperate to the maximum extent so that there would be ownership on the part of the executive branch, the governor and the government, that has to do the implementation. One of the reasons we've been delaying the certification of the fiscal plan right now was because we were having very, very positive and very cooperative and very, I would say, leaning forward discussions with the government, and we were coming closer and closer on many, many issues. There's a series of letters that get written and say, the next version's missing something. We'd like you to improve on this. There's something else we need to see. But it's been a very cooperative relationship. And the reason for that was because we want to work together. No one wants to be in opposition. At the same time, I spent 16 months as the Minister of Finance of Ukraine during a very difficult time, post-revolution. We had been attacked and had part of the country already occupied. 20% of the GDP was under occupation, and we were in an IMF program. And the IMF program was like an oversight board, except it has carrots, which is money that they can lend to the sovereign government. The oversight board has no carrots to offer, unfortunately. But the government and the parliament in Ukraine used often the IMF as the bad guy in some of the policy debates. We had to do major pension reform in Ukraine. We had to do major tax reform. We had to reduce the fiscal deficit tremendously in 1 year. We didn't have 3 years or 5 years or 7 years, all while financing a war. And many of the policies were not popular socially. You can imagine. And often what you do is you use the IMF in that situation and say, look, our hands are tied. We have to do it. And you kind of lean on them. And I think the Oversight Board can play that role as well for the governor. And if it helps to blame the Oversight Board, it's okay. The Oversight Board's not political, not running for office. None of the board members are running for office. I'm not running for office. It's not about politics. So if it requires blaming us to get some difficult decisions adopted, it's all right.
So can you jump to the bondholders a little bit? I'm a bond person. So how is that stacking up? So of the different authorities, starting with the general obligation and COFINA and PREPA, where are the largest defaults or those that are in the Title III process at this point?
So the way Puerto Rico was able to structure debt, there is the Commonwealth itself, which has general obligation debt, constitutionally guaranteed, and the Commonwealth is in Title III, is in this bankruptcy-like process. COFINA is a separate legal entity which collects sales tax, sales and use tax, and that entity is also in this Title III, this bankruptcy process. And there, the debt in each case, the bonded debt is around $15, $17 billion in each one, par value. Then PREPA, the electricity utility, has about $9 billion of debt. It is also in this Title III process, this bankruptcy-like process. And PRASA, which is the water utility, is also in the bankruptcy-like process. There are a series of other entities, the University of Puerto Rico, for instance, that have agreed, PRASA, the water utility, is not in Title III. PRASA, the water utility, is not in default, in fact. I misspoke. PRASA is in a agreed kind of abeyance of payment with its creditors. I misspoke. UPR, the University of Puerto Rico, is in a similar situation, not in that bankruptcy process, and then there's a series of others. There are at least 17 different issuers of debt in Puerto Rico, so it's very, very complex. we're in, I'll call it like 3 different processes to deal with the debt. One is being sued all the time in litigation. There's a lot of litigation. None of it begun by Puerto Rico. Then there's a court-ordered mediation process. 5 federal judges have been chosen by the court as to be mediators, and we have a mediation process, which is confidential, but it is constant. And then we have just negotiations ongoing at all times. One of those negotiations, and let me just back up a minute, if it's not in the Title III bankruptcy, then the government leads those negotiations, not the Oversight Board. So in the case of PRASA, it's the government and PRASA leading those discussions. And in the case of the Government Development Bank, another entity with debt, which has recently reached a consensual agreement with its creditors for restructuring, the government did that on a consensual basis without going to the Title III bankruptcy court. It is the goal of everyone to do this on as much of a consensual basis as possible, because litigation is so incredibly costly and so incredibly time-consuming. If you think about Argentina or other places, that can go on for a decade, and that's not only the cost of lawyers and the court and so on, but the cost of not having access to the market, the cost of the uncertainty of being in bankruptcy, being in that process to the private sector as a whole, the cost in the marketplace for private sector borrowers because they're being affected by the credit risk mentality and their costs going up, so they then invest less. It has a huge, huge effect on the overall economic development the longer this goes on. So doing this consensually, if at all possible, to the extent possible, with each of these different groups, and as I said, GDB is happening right now, is really to the benefit of Puerto Rico. Now, if it can't be done consensually, well, then you have other options. But that is the #1 goal.
Right. I mean, ultimately, it's up to the court.
That's correct. You
That's
take the plan of adjustment to the court confirms it or not.
Right. So there have been some, not to get too far into technical bond land, but there have been some disputes over, for example, there's a section of the Bankruptcy Code 922 that says when you have a dedicated revenue source, that a special revenue bond will continue to be paid while in bankruptcy. So you have your general obligation bonds that are backed by everything. You have pensions, all of those things fall under the debt adjustment in Chapter 9. But revenue bonds, so if it's a water bond or something like that, those bondholders have a lien on that revenue source and it continues to get paid, unless it's in bankruptcy itself. And so in Puerto Rico, in the Title III, the judge recently ruled that, I think it's the Highway Authority that has special revenues, that those were not considered special revenues, that those could...
The tolls.
Right, the tolls. And that put a shock through the market, even though PROMESA is unique to Puerto Rico. What are your thoughts about that? Maybe you can.
No, I'm not going to give my thoughts about that specific issue. What I will say is I think that Puerto Rico provides, it's a microcosm of all of the important things in municipal restructurings right now, and I think that everyone is watching to see how the different securitized revenue stream bonds are being treated, because it's to some extent going to be symbolic of the rest of the market. I think the decisions that are going to be taken in this court, and it will all be appealed, if not once, then many times. But the decisions that come out of this are going to be, I think, very, very important for the municipal bond market. I think there are other elements of what's happening in Puerto Rico that are important as well from municipalities fiscally. And I think, instead of looking at Puerto Rico, which it is extraordinarily sad and the devastation is extraordinary and the situation is beyond unacceptable for American citizens. That said, some of the solutions that we can put together and put in place, I think can be role models for other municipalities, for other states. I think if we can fix the pension system, move everyone to a defined contribution system, ensure that pensions are getting paid, and that there's not this enormous gap, this overhang that hangs over so many states, I think we'll have accomplished something extraordinary. If we can get our Medicaid costs under control while still providing proper health care, that will be something that other states will be looking to Puerto Rico as a role model. And I think There are a lot of things that Puerto Rico can do right now that actually will put it, not just allow it to catch up in some area, but it will actually enable it to be the role model.
So we have a few more minutes before we hear from the audience. So you're doing all this hard work over the next few years to get Puerto Rico back on its feet. If you were looking forward 10 years from now, what would you want to see in Puerto Rico? What sort of economy would it have? How would it be financing itself?
10 years from now, I would see a very robust tourism economy that has a wide variety of kind of specialty areas of tourism, not just competing kind of every day with the Dominican Republic, but medical tourism. Puerto Rico has an extraordinary medical school, American standard, American certified, but with the bilingual nature of the economy and of the population, this is a place that we could attract Latin America, we could attract much of the Caribbean for very high quality medical care. Other types of specialty tourism like that, ecotourism. You can't imagine a 100-mile wide island with more than 30 different ecosystems all in one small space. If done properly, this is something that lasts forever and can attract a whole unique group of tourism. So the tourism industry, I would like to maintain the manufacturing base, in particular in pharma and biopharma. Again, Puerto Rico has the engineers coming out of universities that are well-trained, well-qualified. I'd like to be able to keep that base and grow it. I think that there is, again, like IT, the human capital area. Puerto Rico is ripe for that segment of the economy. It is a place that attracts people. The lifestyle is something that people in, it's as close to Silicon Valley type of lifestyle in terms of whether you're going to get, if not better. And the last is services. I think that probably is the one single space where they could grow massively with bilingual business services. And I think it's an incredibly wonderful place to live. So you can attract people back to the island if you can provide them with the basic education, healthcare, roads that they come to expect. And I think that it will have access to credit markets. But hopefully we'll learn our lessons from this credit debacle and ensure that they never actually borrow too much again.
Do you think triple tax exemption was a mistake, maybe, because it lowered the borrowing costs so much for Puerto Rico?
Again, you have to have some comparative advantages. I'm not sure that Puerto Rico should give that up quite so soon.
There you go. So we're a little early. Can we start taking questions from the audience?
Hello, Ms. Duresco. I have a quick question. You assure that PROMESA and the board's fiscal plan will be good for the people of Puerto Rico? If this is true, why have all political parties and most political organizations now voiced their opposition to the board and its plans and requirements for Puerto Rico? Let me give you an example. Recently, the governor, Ricardo Rosselló, came out and denied that he will, he came out and said that he will oppose the new labor reform laws that the board is trying to dictate to Puerto Rico. So
I think we need to kind of separate fact from fiction. Labor reform was proposed by the governor, not by the board. And he has pulled his own labor reform proposal from the marketplace. That's his choice. I actually believe labor reform is extremely important for Puerto Rico. And I think that's why he proposed it in the first place. It was not popular when he proposed it, there's no question. But I think and it's the loudest voices that you hear in a room when they're unhappy. But let's think about what we're talking about. What is labor reform in Puerto Rico? We're talking about, first of all, the private sector, which is unfortunately very small. It's so small that it can't finance the large government and the cost of government today. So how do we grow the private sector? How do we make it easier to do business? Labor reform is one, and what does that mean? It means getting closer to mainland standards of labor. It means having the ability to have employment at will. It's a very simple concept. I think almost every state on the mainland has employment at will. What does it mean for an employer? What it means is that if you don't have employment at will, you do one of two things. You hesitate before you hire, because the cost of severance, because you don't have an employment at will, is so high that you delay hiring. Or you hire, but you hire in the informal market. You hire on a cash basis. And that employee in the informal market is not getting the benefits of basic federal law. They're not getting the benefits of maternity. They're not getting Social Security. They're not getting any of the benefits of an employee at will would have if they were in the formal employment. That's one example of the labor reform proposed by the governor and now revoked by the governor, yes. And yes, supported by the board. The difference of opinion between the governor and the board was the date, the effective date of implementation. Nothing more on that policy. There is also in Puerto Rico the additional vacation and sick pay. It adds up together with the Christmas bonus to the equivalent of about 28 days or more than what is federally mandated. No one is suggesting that an employer shouldn't give you whatever the employer chooses to give you in vacation and sick leave. The proposal that the governor had made, again, we supported, was to have that from 28 to 14 over a period of time. The difference was in the date of effective implementation. Why is this important? Lowering the cost of employing people will help businesses to hire more and to bring more people out of the informal economy into the formal economy. The fact of the matter is, people are leaving Puerto Rico before the hurricane for jobs on the mainland. They're choosing to live in Florida, where those types of protections don't exist. In fact, the only place that has this level of protection on private sector employment is France, and even Macron has started to dismantle some of those additional protections. So if you ask me, would this be good for the people of Puerto Rico? I think it would be very good to create jobs in Puerto Rico. I think it would be very good to have more employment in Puerto Rico, more opportunities to stay on the island and not leave.
Hi, Natalie. My name is Brian Tam. I'm a current Booth student, and my wife was a graduate of Harris's MPP program. Thanks for being here. Quick question, just in terms of government's fiscal balances. I think the latest TSA report reported $2 billion of cash at the government entity, and there's this questions around when the U.S. is going to give Puerto Rico a loan of $4.5 billion from the Community Reinvestment Act, only when the TSA account gets down to $1.2 billion in assets. And the latest fiscal plan on the 23rd suggests that there would be up to $6 billion of surplus in the budget through 2023, not subject to what they put out tomorrow. Just curious in terms of how long can Puerto Rico stay outside of the capital markets, and where will they be able to get that funding from the federal government?
So there's a lot of questions wrapped up in there. Yes, the single treasury account is at about $2 billion right now. To some extent, that is a seasonality issue because the way the COFINA sales tax works, there's a period of time where the bondholders get a portion of it. They're not getting it right now, but it's going into a segregated account. And the government shares in the sales tax. And then when that bucket fills to a certain point, all the sales tax goes to the government. We kind of reach that point and the rest of it goes. So we're in that point in the fiscal year where we're getting all of it. So revenues are higher. The second part of this question has to do with the federal CDLs, community development loans. Community development loans are typically $5 million after a hurricane. They're made available for municipalities. Florida, Texas, wherever you get hit by this hurricane, you can apply for the amount. It's typically up to $5 million, but the equivalent of whatever your revenues lost were. So you have a period of time after the hurricane where you cannot collect the same revenues that you do normally. I mean, in Puerto Rico, it was even worse in the sense that we didn't have the electricity. Even if businesses, could function, you couldn't collect taxes. So you have a loss of revenues for some period of time. And you can borrow up to that loss of revenues for either a half a year or a year. Now, it's been made a year for Puerto Rico. Because Puerto Rico is so large, the economy is so large, they made the size of the loan larger. It wasn't limited to $5 million for the Commonwealth, although it's still $5 million for each individual municipality. So we have 78 municipalities who are right now writing their loan applications and eligible to receive up to $5 million for revenues lost for each of the 78. But the Commonwealth can receive up to $4.8 billion. And the Commonwealth is negotiating the terms of that loan with the federal government. We're not a party to the negotiations. It's complicated because it's a large amount. Frankly, it's not the same as 5 million. It's almost 5 billion. It's complicated because the Commonwealth is in this Title III court. So the federal government as a lender wants to ensure its place in the bankruptcy in line and where its position is. So there are a lot of other types of details to the loan agreement that a normal municipality in Florida or Texas after hurricane would not have to deal with, and Puerto Rico does. The governor and Secretary Mnuchin have reached agreement on the principal terms, and I think the documentation is underway. When would they reach the 1.1 billion? Well, PREPA and PRASA both have liquidity challenges, and the federal government is not providing them, has decided at this stage not to provide them directly a loan, so the Commonwealth will have to lend to them. When the Commonwealth fully lends to them, that will draw down the Treasury level significantly. And I think that there are other payables that haven't been paid. Any liquidity manager starts when you're worried after a hurricane, you start maybe putting off paying your vendors and things like that. I think that will be paid, and they might get to the 1.1. I can't predict at this point that is a certainty because I can't predict what the levels of lending will be to PREPA and PRASA. But that cash balance issue that you mentioned is also unique to Puerto Rico. It's not traditional or typical in the $5 million municipality CDL. So these are all terms that were kind of added on because of Puerto Rico's unique circumstances, and many of them have been called discriminatory. And the governor, as I said, just reached agreement on the terms with the Secretary of Treasury of the United States.
Yeah, I might just chime in on the last question is that I think the estimate was $50 to $80 billion worth of damage from Irma and Maria together, and the governor's asking for $95 billion. FEMA is talking about a $30 billion payment, and I think HUD is talking about somewhere around $10 or $15 million. So there will be some money from the federal government to help rebuild the infrastructure.
It's important to note that that loan is a loan, first of all, and a small piece. The disaster relief is grant money for Puerto Rico, like it is for every other devastated part of the United States after a disaster like this. And the sources are, as you say, primarily FEMA under Homeland Security and HUD with the CDBG program, the Community Development Block Grant. And the expectation, and one of the last versions of the fiscal plan, is around $45, $47 billion in grants, disaster relief to be received most likely over, like I said, the next 10 years. You all know that after Katrina, I think they still receive funding even in year like 15 or something. It takes a long time. In terms of putting a number on the actual assessment of damages, that's still ongoing. So there's the 95 Build Back Better plan that the governor put out with the support of the governor in New York. There are the FEMA estimates right now, and the way FEMA works is, the reason it takes 15 years sometimes is because this assessment of damages goes on, and they might do funding beyond that. But that's the amount that's more or less been appropriated to date.
Hello, I am Jose Porrata. I'm a student at the Community of International Relations, and I graduated from the University of Puerto Rico. So,
congratulations.
Yeah, and so, regardless of my feelings, I'm actually curious as to handling the critiques of like the heavy austerity measures, and how that'll impact development, like education, and like agriculture, which is sorely underdeveloped, and if they're like and has like there been any consideration to any how could I put this and pardon my stutter and voice, but if there's any innovative or a risk or a developmental packages or stimulus packages to like these areas that could actually like help not only help stimulate like these developing areas, but help sort of mitigate like a lot of the criticism towards the heavy austerity measures as like imposed by Promesa.
So there are no austerity measures forced on the government by Promesa. The goal is to balance the budget. And the governor is right. He said it today, and he's right. It's his decision in terms of how to balance it. All we have to do is be convinced that it actually is getting to balance. And so those decisions, whether you, for example, close, I think the lady said 200 schools have been closed already, 325 to be closed. I was involved in closing schools in rural areas in Ukraine as well. When you have depopulation of certain areas, you end up not providing the children that remain in those areas with the best possible education. And if you can instead move children to a hub school near, relatively nearby, that has specialty teachers, that has classes for every grade rather than a group of people with various grades, it actually is a better education that you're providing. So some people look at closing school as an austerity measure, and some people look at it as a better opportunity for their child to get a more equal education to those who are in the non-depopulated areas. So I don't even like to use the word austerity, because no one's trying to impose austerity. We are trying to balance. And then the question is, how do you choose your priorities? One of the areas that nobody really talked about today, but there's an incentives code in Puerto Rico. And the governor and the agency called DDEC has just been going through and determining who gets those incentives. And they will be making those determinations. I'm not involved in that. They've developed a calculation for what these sectors of the economy give back and whether or not they want to provide them with a variety of tax incentives. Puerto Rico has a wealth of tax credits, tax exemptions, tax incentives, all kinds of things, which haven't in the past always yielded results. So I welcome, and I was very happy that they are re-looking at it all to make a fresh decision. But agriculture may be one that remains in the package of incentives, I can't tell you. But it's not like all those incentives have gone away, they haven't. That's part of the package of costs in the budget. And they're not eliminated entirely. In terms of other aid, the fact of the matter is Puerto Rico doesn't have what a sovereign might have to lean towards the World Bank for help or even the Caribbean Development Bank for help. And that's unfortunate. You don't have that other tool that maybe a sovereign would have in a situation like this. What we have is the ability to get this federal disaster assistance, which is going to have a huge, huge positive effect on Puerto Rico if spent well on renewing the infrastructure. I mean, think about it, $45 billion of renewed infrastructure. If your GNP is about $70 billion, that's a significant amount of money. And you can do a significant amount in public housing with that money, because the HUD money, to a large extent, goes for public housing. You can do a large amount on roads, on infrastructure. Part of it will go to rebuilding the transmission and distribution system, hopefully making it more reliable, not just building back what we had, but building back better, as the governor said. So I think you can't take for granted that that is a large stimulus right now. When you look at the fiscal plan proposals that have come from the governor, the proposed fiscal plans, you'll see that growth for the first time in over a decade returns to Puerto Rico next year because of the inflow of these monies. And it has a short-term stimulus effect, but it has a long-term infrastructure rebuilding effect. That's the only silver lining in the devastation that you have.
Swami, we're going to just take one more question, unfortunately, because we're out of time. But I think what we could do is stick around and have people come up.
Hello, I'm a graduate student here at the university, and also, like my friend, a graduate from the University of Puerto Rico. And first of all, thank you for recognizing the concerns of the protesters where it concerns the undemocratic nature of the imposition of the board. Because it is an imposed creature of Congress, would you support an amendment to PROMESA wherein the Congress would assume the millions of dollars in the board's operating expenses that the struggling Puerto Rican government currently has to cover? And on the subject of amending PROMESA, what carrots could be added, such as those that you mentioned in the case of the IMF and Ukraine?
So I'm not in favor of amending PROMESA in general. I think it was a long battle. It was a hard battle between the two parties to come to some balance, and I don't think that it would be realistic to say to you that I think they're going to amend it, or that if I thought they were going to amend it, how that would end up. So I can't say that I'm in favor of that. In terms of the costs of Promesa, I know the costs are high. What I can tell you is that the costs of mismanagement are much, much higher. Promesa is temporary. And if done well, it saves Puerto Rico money, it saves jobs, it saves you what would otherwise happen if Promesa was not in place, which is a grab of what assets Puerto Rico has, and a disruption to the pension system that people can't even imagine. In Ukraine, we didn't have the same type of benefit to make these types of pension decisions that Puerto Rico has. I've actually been a minister when I have to decide who doesn't get their pension payments this month because we don't have enough money in the treasury. When the revolution ended in Ukraine, there was less than $200,000, the equivalent of $200,000 in the treasury for 45 million people. We had to decide what to pay every month, who didn't get their salaries. We got out of that in the course of a year, but it took enormous effort. And when that was over, I'll be honest with you, people forgot very quickly what it was like when they weren't getting their pensions regularly. Now they get it. No, now they're just upset about the amount, which is fair. It's the lowest pension in Europe. But at least they're getting it every month. We weren't able to put gasoline in the railways. And so my point is that you have to take into consideration what would happen if Promesa wasn't in place. There is some pain to the adjustment because it's changed. It's not popular. It's popular to spend money, but you can only spend it when you have it. And at some point, the credit cards stop allowing you to keep charging. It's like a family. And the credit cards have stopped allowing Puerto Rico to keep charging. We can't borrow. So the reality is we have to make very difficult choices. UPR is the jewel. I congratulate you, graduates from UPR. It's the jewel of Puerto Rico. It gives an education, a high-quality education to so many students. We have to make sure University of Puerto Rico can continue. But does that mean it has to have all those campuses? I don't know. Does it mean that it has to have that low of a tuition for everyone or that low of a tuition for those who are really in need? So that we can keep it going. Because we can't make 2 and 2 into 8. We can only have 2 and 2 make 4. And those difficult decisions, we should get them done now. We should get them done while we have the stimulus of federal funds, because it will be less painful for us in a growing economy, so that we never return after this federal stimulus to the economy that we came from. And that was before I got there. It was before Promesa. The economy, the decade of decline was not a result of Promesa. Promesa is the result of a decade of decline. We want to come out of the federal monies and go like this. We want to change Puerto Rico so that, we don't have to debate the issues that the protesters are debating, and instead we can debate, would it be better to put more money into computer labs or in schools or foreign language training? Those are the decisions you want to be making, but you have to have money to make those decisions. Thank you.
Thank you.